2:14 in the morning. The red neon sign of the diner buzzed like a trapped insect, casting a bloody glow over the linoleum. Outside, the city was a graveyard of silence. Inside, the air tasted of burnt coffee and cheap floor wax. Rachel S. Jackson, 25, a waitress with an apron stained by 12 hours of grease and a soul worn down to the rivets, was wiping table 4 when the atmosphere shifted. The bell above the door didn't just chime. It felt like a warning. A girl stepped into the light. K.H. Keen, 6 years old, looking like a discarded porcelain doll. She wore a silk dress that cost more than Rachel's yearly rent, now wrinkled and damp with the night's humidity. Her patent leather shoes, meant for ballrooms, clicked hollowly on the cracked tiles. She didn't look at the pie display or the empty stools. She walked straight toward Rachel, her small hands trembling so violently they blurred. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice a thin wire about to snap. "Don't let her take me back to the car." Behind the child, a woman, Susan W. Keen, loomed in the doorway, her smile as sharp and cold as a razor blade. A man in a dark fedora stood behind her, a shadow among shadows, his hand resting too close to the inside of his blazer. Rachel's gut screamed, "Walk away!" It was the sound of survival, the instinct that had kept her alive in a city that ate girls like her for breakfast. But then Kay's tiny fingers curled around Rachel's stained apron, clinging to the rough fabric as if it were a life raft. "Where's your father, honey?" Rachel asked, her voice steadying even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "He's coming," the child choked out, glancing at the man in the fedora. "But the monsters got here first." Thunder rattled the sugar shakers on the counter, a low growl that felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The neon light of the diner flickered, a rhythmic, dying pulse that bathed the linoleum in a sickly shade of crimson. Rachel S. Jackson didn't move. She felt the weight of the girl, Kay, pressing against her thigh, the child's small fingers bunching the fabric of her stained apron into tight, white-knuckled knots. It was the grip of someone drowning. Across the laminate counter, Susan W. Keen stood with a poise that felt manufactured in a laboratory. Her dark hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, leaving her eyes wide, unblinking, and devoid of anything resembling warmth. She looked at the diner, the cracked vinyl booths, the smell of old grease, the weary woman behind the counter, with the kind of clinical disgust one might reserve for a smudge on a window pane. "Kay, darling," Susan said, her voice a polished silver blade, "don't be dramatic. You're upsetting the help. Let go of the lady's uniform and come to the car. We have a long drive ahead of us." Kay didn't answer. She only squeezed harder, a small whimper escaping her throat. The sound hit Rachel right in the center of her chest, a dull ache that tasted like her own childhood, spent waiting for a protector who never showed up. "She doesn't want to go with you," Rachel said. Her own voice surprised her. It wasn't loud, but it had the steady, metallic ring of a shovel hitting a stone. Susan's smile didn't falter. It sharpened. "I beg your pardon?" "The girl," Rachel repeated, stepping out from behind the safety of the counter, keeping Kay tucked firmly behind her hip. "She's terrified, and judging by the way you're looking at her, she's got a damn good reason to be." The man in the fedora, still a silhouette against the rainy glass of the door, shifted his weight. The movement was subtle, professional, and terrifying. He didn't speak, but the air in the diner suddenly felt heavy, the oxygen fleeing the room as if it sensed a vacuum. "You're a waitress, aren't you?" Susan asked, her tone shifting into something dangerously soft. She reached into her designer handbag, pulling out a slim leather wallet. She plucked $200 bills from it and flicked them onto the counter where a puddle of spilled soda still sat. "That's more than you make in a week of serving eggs to truckers. Take the tip, go into the kitchen, and forget you ever saw us. This is a family matter." Rachel looked at the money. It was crisp, clean, and smelled of expensive perfume. It represented a month of paid utilities, a pair of shoes without holes in the soles, a moment of breathing room in a life that was one long gasp for air. Then she looked down at the top of Kay's head. The girl was shaking so hard Rachel could feel it through her own bones. Family doesn't make children look like they're facing a firing squad, Rachel said. She didn't touch the money. Instead, she reached back and placed a hand on Kay's shoulder, a silent promise. The grill is off. The kitchen is closed. And I'm not going anywhere. Susan's face finally cracked. The mask of the grieving or frustrated mother fell away, revealing a cold, jagged vacancy. You have no idea who you are dealing with, girl. You are a footnote in a story you aren't even qualified to read. Give me the child, or I will ensure that by tomorrow morning, you don't even have this pathetic job to come back to. Then I guess I'll have plenty of free time. Rachel shot back, her heart drumming a frantic, jagged rhythm against her ribs. The man at the door took a step forward. The floorboards didn't even creak under his boots. He was a predator moving through tall grass. Rachel felt the hair on her arms stand up. She knew she was outmatched. She was a woman with a plastic name tag and a damp rag, standing against people who bought and sold lives like hers before breakfast. But as the man reached for the inner lapel of his blazer, the heavy double doors of the diner swung open again. The wind didn't just blow in. It seemed to explode into the room, bringing with it the scent of rain, expensive tobacco, and raw, unfiltered power. The man in the fedora stopped instantly, his hand freezing mid-motion. Even Susan took a half-step back, her composed face flickering with a sudden, genuine spike of fear. A new figure filled the doorway. He was tall, draped in a charcoal overcoat that shimmered with rainwater. His presence so massive it seemed to shrink the room. His eyes were dark, scanning the scene with the lethal efficiency of a heat-seeking missile. They skipped over Susan, ignored the man in the fedora, and locked onto the small girl hiding behind the waitress in the light blue uniform. "Daddy!" Kay's voice was a broken sob. Rachel didn't let go. Even as the man, Keen J. Ballard, strode toward them, his boots echoing like gunshots on the tile, Rachel kept her arm anchored around the girl. She didn't know who he was. She only knew he was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. Keen stopped 3 feet away. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at Rachel's hand, still protectively gripping his daughter's shoulder. And then he looked into Rachel's eyes. He saw the fear there, but he also saw the defiance, the neon shield she had built out of nothing but nerve. For a long, agonizing second, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the rain hitting the roof. "You," Keen said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in Rachel's teeth. "Why are you still holding her?" Rachel didn't flinch. She tightened her grip. "Because I haven't decided if you're the hero or the monster yet." A ghost of a smile, cold and grim, touched the corner of Keen Ballard's mouth. He looked at the wicked stepmother cowering in the corner, then back at the waitress who had nothing to lose. "Fair enough," he murmured. "Let's find out." The night had started like 1,000 others, marked by the rhythmic hiss of the overhead sprinklers and the lonely clatter of silverware against stoneware. But table 4 had been wrong from the moment they sat down. Rachel moved with the mechanical grace of a woman who had spent 5 years balancing heavy trays and dodging wandering hands, but her eyes never left the booth in the corner. It wasn't just the contrast of their presence, the sharp, expensive lines of their coats against the cracked vinyl. It was the silence. Usually, families in a diner at 2 a.m. were either traveling or fleeing, wrapped in the frantic energy of the road. But this silence was heavy. It was a suffocating, intentional quiet. "Refill?" Rachel asked, her voice sounding thin in the stillness. "Susan W." Keen didn't look up. She was leaning forward, her elbows on the formica table, her fingers interlaced like the teeth of a trap. She was whispering, a low, sibilant sound that barely rose above the hum of the refrigerator. "You are a burden, Kay," Susan murmured. The words were soft, polished, and utterly devastating. "Your father thinks you're safe with me. He thinks you're a good girl. But good girls don't make mistakes. Good girls don't cost people like us our time." Rachel's hand paused over the coffee mug. She saw Kay's hands. They were small, pale, and trembling so violently that the hot chocolate in her cup was sending tiny concentric ripples toward the rim. The girl's head was bowed so low her chin touched her chest, her hair falling like a curtain to hide the tears Rachel knew were falling. "Drink your cocoa, Kay," Susan commanded. "Before I decide you don't need a seat in the car at all." Rachel felt a cold spike of adrenaline. This wasn't a mother disciplining a child. This was a predator playing with its dinner. She moved to the edge of the table, the damp rag in her hand suddenly feeling like a weapon she didn't know how to use. She began to wipe a spot that was already clean, leaning in just enough to break the oppressive circle Susan had drawn around the girl. "Everything okay here, folks?" Rachel asked, her tone forced into a cheerful, service industry lilt that felt like a lie on her tongue. Susan's eyes flicked up. They were a piercing, icy blue, and they didn't just look at Rachel, they appraised her. In a heartbeat, Susan had calculated the cost of Rachel's uniform, the mileage on her tired eyes, and the lack of a wedding ring on her finger. She dismissed her with a single, bored blink. "The service is fine, waitress," Susan said, the word waitress dripping with a casual, inherited cruelty. "Our business, however, is private. I suggest you find something else to polish." Rachel didn't move. She saw the girl's eyes for the first time. Huge, dark, and hollowed out by a fear that no 6-year-old should be able to name. Kay looked at Rachel, and for a split second, the child's lips parted as if to scream. But Susan's hand moved across the table, her manicured nails digging into the soft flesh of the girl's wrist. "Don't," Susan whispered to the child, her voice a serrated edge. "Not a word." The man in the fedora at the door shifted, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He wasn't looking at the menu. He was looking at the clock. The ticking of the seconds on the wall felt like a countdown, and Rachel realized with a jolt of pure, instinctive terror that whatever was happening at table 4 wasn't meant to end with a bill and a tip. The secret wasn't that they were a family in trouble. The secret was that table 4 was a crime scene in the making, and the only witness was a woman with a name tag that said Rachel and a heart that refused to let her walk away. "I think the girls had enough," Rachel said, her voice dropping the customer service mask. She reached out, not for the cup, but for the girl's hand. The air in the diner turned to ice. Susan's grip on the child's wrist tightened until the girl's knuckles turned gray, and the man at the door took his first purposeful step toward the light. The air in the diner had grown thick, the kind of heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a structural collapse. Susan W. Keene stood up, her movements fluid and expensive, the silk of her blouse whispering against the vinyl booth. She didn't look at the half-empty cup of cocoa or the child trembling beneath her shadow. She looked only at her gold watch, a shimmering circle of indifference. "I've had enough of this defiance, Kay," Susan said, her voice dropping into a register of terrifying, calm finality. "Since you find the company of a waitress so much more comforting than your own family, you can stay here. Perhaps by the time the sun comes up and you're sitting on the curb in the rain, you'll remember who actually provides for you." Kay's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a raw, primal panic. "No. Mother, please. I'll be good. I'll be quiet." Susan didn't blink. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking a sharp, dismissive staccato against the floor. "The car leaves in 30 seconds. With or without you." It was a psychological execution. Rachel watched as the girl scrambled to get out of the booth, her small legs tangling in the hem of her dress. But Susan didn't wait. She beckoned to the man in the fedora, who stepped back into the rainy night, opening the heavy glass door. A gust of wet, freezing wind swept in, dancing with the smell of old grease and floor wax. "Wait!" Kay cried, her voice cracking. As the girl lunged toward the door, Susan reached back, not to grab her hand, but to give her a sharp, forceful shove back toward the counter. It wasn't a push meant to hurt. It was a push meant to discard. "Stay," Susan hissed, the word a whip crack. "Consider it a lesson in gratitude." Kay stumbled, her small shoes sliding on the slick linoleum. She was going to fall, her face heading straight for the sharp edge of a chrome stool. Rachel didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk to her shift or the potential for a lawsuit. She lunged across the pass-through, her hand shooting out like a tether. She caught Kay's wrist just inches from the metal. The girl was vibrating, a frantic, bird-like trembling that traveled up Rachel's arm and settled in her own heart. Rachel pulled her close, tucking the child into the crook of her elbow, shielding her with the only thing she had, her body and a stained white apron. "She's not going anywhere with you," Rachel said, her voice shaking but loud enough to rattle the sugar shakers. Susan stopped in the doorway, the rain misting her hair into a halo of dark diamonds. She turned slowly, her face contorting into something ugly and jagged. "Release her. Now. You are interfering in a private family matter. That is kidnapping." "It's abandonment," Rachel countered, her grip on Kay's hand tightening. "I saw you push her. I heard what you said. You don't leave a 6-year-old in a diner at 3 in the morning because she upset you. You're a servant." "Rachel," Susan said, her voice dripping with a venomous condescension, "you fetch coffee. You don't dictate the parenting of the Ballard estate. If you don't let go of that child's hand this instant, I will call the police. I will tell them a deranged waitress tried to snatch my daughter. How do you think that ends for you? A girl with no money, no status, and a record for felony abduction." Rachel felt the weight of the threat. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She knew how the world worked. The woman in the designer blazer would be believed. The woman in the light blue uniform would be shackled. Kay looked up at Rachel, her eyes pleading, her tiny fingers digging into Rachel's palm. "Please," the look said. "Don't let go." "Call them," Rachel said, her jaw setting into a hard, stubborn line. "Call the cops. Tell them everything. I'll tell them about the bruises I can see on her wrist from where you grabbed her. I'll tell them about the lesson you were trying to teach. I might lose my job, but you'll have a hell of a time explaining this to the girl's father." Susan's eyes narrowed into slits. For the first time, a flicker of genuine hesitation crossed her face at the mention of the father. The man in the fedora stepped back inside, his hand moving toward the shadow of his coat. His eyes locked on Rachel with a predatory intensity. "You're making a very dangerous mistake," Susan whispered, the rain howling behind her. "I've made plenty of mistakes," Rachel replied, pulling Kay further behind the neon shield of the counter. "But protecting a child isn't one of them. The line is drawn right here. You aren't crossing it." The standoff hung in the air, thick and volatile, until the sound of a heavy engine roared to life in the parking lot, and a second set of headlights cut through the gloom, blinding everyone in the diner. The headlights outside didn't just illuminate the diner. They cut through the grime of the windows like twin searchlights, bleaching the world white. The roar of the engine was a low, mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate the very liquid in the coffee pots. Inside, the man in the fedora finally moved. He didn't lung at Rachel. He didn't reach for the child. He simply stepped to the side, his spine straightening into a posture of rigid, terrifying subservience. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest as the heavy glass doors groaned on their hinges. The ghost had arrived. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to lose its rhythmic patter, turning into a muffled static against the sudden gravity of the man who stepped into the light. Keen J. Ballard didn't enter a room so much as he annexed it. He was draped in a charcoal overcoat that looked heavy with the night's dampness, his presence a dark, immovable weight that made the neon signs flicker and fail. Susan's bravado vanished. The woman who had just been threatening Rachel with the police and the weight of her status suddenly looked small, her expensive blazer appearing like a costume that no longer fit. She took a sharp, jagged breath, her hands fluttering to her throat. "Keen," she whispered, the name catching like a burr in her throat. "You're early. I was just—" Kay was being difficult, and I thought a little discipline. Keen didn't look at her. He didn't even acknowledge the air she breathed. His gaze swept the diner with a lethal, clinical precision. It passed over the empty booths, the grease-stained menus, and the man in the fedora, before coming to a dead stop on the girl huddled behind the counter, and the waitress who refused to let her go. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs. She had heard the name Ballard whispered in the late-night corners of the city, a name associated with shadows, iron-fisted control, and a fortune built on things people were too afraid to name. This was the king of the city, a man who moved mountains with a nod and buried enemies with a look. He walked toward them, his boots echoing with the finality of a gavel. Every step felt like a heartbeat skipped. Rachel's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the laminate counter, but she didn't retreat. She felt Kay's small, shivering body pressed against her hip, and the protector arc she had stumbled into tonight reached its breaking point. Keen stopped 3 feet from the counter. Up close, he smelled of cold rain and expensive tobacco. His eyes were dark, hooded, and unreadable, but they weren't looking at the girl yet. They were looking at Rachel's hand, the way her fingers were interlaced with Kay's, the way she had positioned her own body as a physical barrier between the child and the world. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the texture of grinding stone. It was a voice used to being obeyed without question. "I'm the person who isn't letting her go," Rachel said. Her voice trembled, a betrayal of the terror screaming in her nerves, but she kept her chin up. "Not until I know exactly who is taking her." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or a grim curiosity, crossed Keen's face. Behind him, Susan found her voice again, a shrill, desperate sound. "Keen, don't listen to her. She's a delusional waitress. She tried to take Kay. She's been filling her head with lies." "Silence, Susan," Keen said. He didn't turn around. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke the words, and the woman went instantly, chillingly mute. He turned his focus back to Rachel. He looked at her name tag, then at the smudge of flour on her cheek, and finally back into her eyes. He was searching for the crack in her armor, the moment she would realize who he was and crumble. But Rachel only tightened her hold on Kay. "She's terrified of your wife?" Rachel said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "She was going to leave her here, in the dark, to teach her a lesson." Keen's gaze finally dropped to his daughter. Kay looked up at him, her face a mask of tear-streaked exhaustion. She didn't run to him. She stayed tucked behind Rachel, her tiny hand still anchored to the waitress's apron. The king of the city looked at his daughter, then at the stranger protecting her, and the silence stretched until it felt like it would snap the glass in the windows. "Is that true, Kay?" Keen asked softly. The girl didn't speak. She only nodded, a small, jerky movement, and buried her face in Rachel's side. Ballard stood perfectly still, but the air around him seemed to darken. He looked at the woman in the stained apron, the girl who had nothing, yet had dared to stand against his name, and for the first time that night, the coldness in his eyes shifted into something else. "You have a lot of courage for someone who serves coffee for a living," he murmured. "Courage is free," Rachel replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. Unlike common decency, apparently, the silence in the diner was no longer the heavy, oppressive weight of a threat. It had shifted into the clinical, terrifying stillness of a courtroom. Ballard stood like a monolith in the center of the room, his charcoal coat dripping water onto the linoleum in a slow, rhythmic tap that felt like the ticking of a clock. Susan stepped forward, her heels clicking tentatively. "Keen, darling, you can't possibly believe this person. She's looking for a payout. She's seen your face in the papers and she's playing the hero to get into your pockets. Kay is just tired. She's imagining things." Keen held up a single hand. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't even acknowledge her presence with a glance. His eyes were fixed entirely on Rachel and the way she had instinctively begun to stroke Kay's hair. Rachel didn't realize she was doing it. Her hand moved in small, soothing circles against the girl's head, her thumb brushing away a stray tear. She was whispering into Kay's ear, words too low for the others to hear, hollow promises of safety that she wasn't sure she could keep, but that the child needed to hear nonetheless. "You're a waitress," Keen said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "In a place that smells like old grease and desperation. You work for tips that wouldn't buy the buttons on my coat. Is that supposed to be an insult?" Rachel asked, her voice cracking but holding its ground. "Because where I come from, the clothes don't make the man." And they certainly don't make the mother. The man in the fedora flinched, but Keen remained motionless. He watched as Kay finally let go of Rachel's apron, not to move toward her father, but to wrap both arms around Rachel's waist, burying her face in the woman's side. It was the ultimate indictment, a daughter's choice, made in the dark, between the woman who birthed her into a life of privilege and the stranger who had offered her a shield. "I've spent a fortune on nannies," Keen murmured almost to himself. "I've hired experts with degrees and pedigrees. I've surrounded her with the best the world has to offer." He finally turned his head, his gaze landing on Susan like a physical blow. And yet, in a diner in the middle of a storm, she finds the only person in this city who doesn't fear me enough to let her get hurt. "Keen!" Susan's voice went high and shrill, the sound of a violin string snapping. "I am your wife. This is a disgrace." "You are a mistake," Keen replied. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. "One I am rectifying tonight." He looked back at Rachel. For the first time, the lethal sharpness in his eyes softened, replaced by a profound, somber realization. He saw the stain on her apron, the mark of a night spent serving others, and he saw the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a rarity. "Susan," Keen said, his voice gaining a hard, executive edge, "go to the car. Victor will drive you to the estate. You will have 1 hour to pack your things. My lawyers will meet you at the gate. If you ever approach my daughter again, the police will be the least of your concerns." Susan opened her mouth to scream, to protest, to lie one last time, but the man in the fedora, Victor, was already moving. He didn't touch her, but his presence was an iron wall. With a look of pure, unchecked hatred directed at Rachel, Susan turned and fled into the rain. The diner doors swung shut, leaving the three of them in the neon-lit quiet. Keen took a step toward the counter. Rachel didn't move away this time. She felt the girl against her, felt the way Kay's breathing was finally beginning to level out. "I came here expecting to find my daughter in the hands of a woman I thought I knew," Keen said, stopping just inches from the counter. "Instead, I found her in the hands of a woman I need to know." He reached out, his large, scarred hand moving toward Kay. The girl hesitated for a second, then reached out and took her father's thumb. But even then, she didn't let go of Rachel's hand. "She won't let go of you," Keen observed, his dark eyes meeting Rachel's. "Maybe she's tired of people letting go," Rachel said softly. Keen nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you shouldn't either. This diner, this life, it doesn't suit a woman who can stare down a Ballard." He reached into his coat and pulled out a card, placing it on the counter next to the $200 Susan had discarded. "My driver will be here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Don't be late, Rachel S. Jackson." "For what?" Rachel asked, her heart leaping into her throat. "For the job you were actually meant for," Keen said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate silk. "Protecting my world." The sun hadn't yet managed to burn through the gray morning mist when the black sedan pulled up to the curb of Rachel's apartment building. The car was a silent, predatory thing, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of peeling brick and overflowing trash bins. Rachel stood on the sidewalk, clutching a single battered suitcase that held everything she owned, which, she realized with a hollow ache, wasn't much more than a few changes of clothes and a bruised sense of hope. The driver, Victor, the man in the fedora from the night before, now hatless and sharp in a black suit, opened the door without a word. As Rachel slid onto the leather seat, the scent of the diner, that permanent perfume of old fryer oil, felt like a skin she was finally shedding. They drove in silence, leaving the jagged skyline of the city behind for the rolling, guarded hills of the north. When the Ballard estate finally appeared, it didn't look like a home. It looked like a statement. Massive iron gates swung open with a mechanical hum, revealing a sprawling fortress of gray stone and glass that seemed to grow out of the very cliffs. Security cameras swiveled to track their progress, and men with the same hard, unblinking eyes as Victor stood at intervals along the winding driveway. The car stopped under a grand stone portico. Standing there, looking small against the massive oak doors, was Kay. She was no longer in the damp silk dress. She wore a simple sweater and leggings, her hair brushed into a neat ponytail. The moment the car door opened, the girl didn't wait for permission. She bolted down the steps, her sneakers slapping against the stone, and threw herself at Rachel's waist. "You came?" Kay whispered, her face buried in the rough wool of Rachel's coat. "I told you I wouldn't let go, didn't I?" Rachel said, her voice thick as she knelt to return the embrace. "Miss Jackson." The voice was like a low vibration in the air. Rachel looked up to see Keen J. Ballard standing at the top of the stairs. In the daylight, he looked even more formidable. A man carved out of shadow and cold intent. He watched the reunion with a gaze that was unreadable, yet strangely focused. He led them inside, the foyer rising up in a cathedral of marble and silent wealth. Rachel felt the urge to walk on her tiptoes, terrified that the grit from her old life would mar the pristine floors. Keen stopped in a sun-drenched library where the walls were lined with leather-bound books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in a century. "Your room is in the east wing, adjacent to Kay's," Keen said, turning to face her. He didn't offer a contract or a list of chores. He simply handed her a heavy silver key. "You are not here to scrub floors or serve tea. I have staff for that. Your only responsibility is the girl." Rachel looked at the key, then back at him. "You're making me her nanny?" "No," Keen corrected, his eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity. "A nanny follows a schedule. A guardian follows an instinct. Last night, you showed me you have the only thing money can't buy, a soul that cannot be bribed or broken. Susan is gone. The people who were supposed to protect Kay failed because they feared me more than they loved her. You are the only one who doesn't fit that description." Rachel felt the weight of the house pressing in on her. The cameras, the armed men, the sheer, crushing power of the Ballard name. "You're putting a lot of trust in a woman who was scraping gum off a table 12 hours ago." "I don't trust the waitress," Keen said, stepping closer until the air between them felt charged with that same electric tension from the diner. "I trust the woman who stood between my daughter and a man who could have ended her life with a nod. You are the only person in this house who doesn't want something from me, Rachel. That makes you the most powerful person here." He turned to Kay, who was watching them both with wide, hopeful eyes. "Show her the way, Kay. This is her home now, and anyone who says otherwise will have to answer to me." As Kay pulled Rachel toward the grand staircase, Rachel looked back over her shoulder. Keen was still standing in the center of the library, a king in his castle, watching her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but something far more dangerous. It was a look of possession. She had escaped the grease and the neon, but as the heavy doors of the estate echoed shut behind her, Rachel realized she hadn't just changed jobs. She had stepped into a world where the stakes were no longer about tips and rent. They were about life, death, and a man who looked at her as if she were the only light in a very dark empire. The hotel suite on the edge of the city smelled of stale cigarettes and the sharp, metallic tang of Susan's desperation. It was a far cry from the marble halls of the Ballard estate, and the humiliation of it tasted like ash in her mouth. She stared at her reflection in the vanity mirror, tracing the faint red mark on her wrist where that creature, that waitress, had dared to touch her. "She's a nobody," Susan hissed to the empty room. "A ghost in a blue uniform." But ghosts didn't take what belonged to Susan W. Keen. She reached into her bag and pulled out a burner phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number that didn't exist on any public registry. It was a connection from her life before Keen, a shadow from a family line that was just as blood-stained as the Ballards, but far less disciplined. The line clicked open. No one said hello. "It's Susan," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, jagged whisper. "I need a problem erased. Not a Ballard. Not the child. Just a nuisance. A girl named Rachel Jackson." There was a low, gravelly chuckle on the other end. "The waitress? Word travels fast, Susan. They say she's the new heartbeat of the Ballard fortress. Keen's got her under glass." I don't care how many men he has at the gate, Susan snapped, her eyes narrowing until they were nothing but chips of blue ice. She's a commoner. She'll have a weakness, a sister, a debt, a favorite grocery store. Find the crack in the armor and drive a blade through it. I want her removed, not scared. Removed. It'll cost you. Keen Ballard isn't a man you steal from and live to talk about it. I'll pay double, Susan promised, her voice shaking with the sheer force of her spite. I want her to realize that a stained apron is all she'll ever be worth. She hung up and threw the phone onto the bed. Outside, the city lights flickered, a sprawling grid of power that she had been exiled from. She had spent years cultivating her position, enduring Keen's coldness and Kay's pathetic neediness, all for the crown of the Ballard Empire. She wouldn't let it be snatched away by a girl who smelled of cheap coffee and dish soap. Meanwhile, miles away behind the stone walls of the estate, Rachel sat on the edge of a bed that felt too soft to be real. The room was vast, filled with shadows and the scent of lavender, but she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the click of Victor's shoes on the tile or the low, vibrating hum of Keen's voice. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the dark expanse of the grounds. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage, safe from the storm, perhaps, but trapped nonetheless. A soft creak came from the hallway. Rachel froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass lamp on the nightstand. She wasn't a waitress tonight. She was a sentry. The door nudged open, and a small, pajama-clad figure slipped inside. Kay didn't say anything. She simply crossed the room and climbed into the bed, pulling the duvet up to her chin. "Did you have a bad dream?" Rachel asked, her voice softening as she sat back down. "I dreamt she came back," Kay whispered, her eyes wide in the dark. "She had a key. She said you were just a dream and that when I woke up, the diner would be gone." Rachel reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind the girl's ear. Her heart ached with a sudden, fierce protectiveness that frightened her. "I'm not a dream, Kay, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm the neon shield, remember?" Kay nodded, her breathing slowing as she drifted back towards sleep. But as Rachel watched the door, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on the back of her neck. She knew women like Susan. They didn't retreat. They regrouped. They didn't forgive. They festered. High above in the master suite, Keen Ballard stood on his balcony, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He watched the light in Rachel's window, his face a mask of unreadable intent. He knew Susan's family. He knew the phone calls that were being made in the dark. He took a slow sip, the burn of the whiskey matching the cold fire in his chest. He had brought a lamb into a den of wolves, but as he remembered the way Rachel had looked at him in the diner, chin up, eyes blazing, refusing to blink, he wondered if the wolves knew what was coming for them. "Let them try," Keen murmured to the wind. He didn't just want a nanny for his daughter. He wanted a queen who could survive the crown. And as the first shadows of Susan's revenge began to stir in the city below, the game for the heart of the Ballard Empire had officially begun. The following evening, the Ballard estate was swallowed by a thick, rolling fog that turned the security lights into blurry, golden orbs. Rachel was tucked into a velvet armchair in the nursery, reading a book to Kay, when the door opened. Keen stood there, his coat over his arm, his presence demanding the room's attention without a single word. "Kay, sleep," he commanded gently. Then his eyes drifted to Rachel. "Miss Jackson, walk with me." It wasn't a request. Rachel followed him through the silent, echoing halls until they reached the underground garage, a cathedral of concrete and chrome. Victor stood by a matte black SUV, the engine already idling with a low, menacing thrum. "Where are we going?" Rachel asked, her hand instinctively smoothing her new, high-collared dress. Felt like armor, but it didn't stop the shiver trailing down her spine. "You spent your life in the light of a diner, Rachel," Keen said, sliding into the back seat and gesturing for her to join him. "You see the world as a series of transactions. Service for a tip, compliance for safety. Tonight you see the foundation." They drove deep into the industrial heart of the city, to a warehouse that looked like a rotting carcass against the river. Men in dark suits stood at every entrance, their hands hidden, their faces carved from granite. As Keen stepped out of the car, they bowed. Not the bow of a servant to a master, but the bow of a soldier to a general. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of salt and iron. In the center of the vast, hollow space, a man sat tied to a chair. He was one of the men who had been whispering in the dark with Susan's contacts. He looked up as Keen approached, his face a mask of terror. Rachel recoiled, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Keen, what is this?" "Power," Keen said, his voice a flat, terrifying calm. He didn't look at the prisoner, he looked at Rachel. Most people think power is the ability to inflict pain. They think it's the gun in Victor's holster or the money in my vault. They think it's fear. He walked toward the man in the chair, who began to blubber, pleading for mercy, promising names, promising loyalty. Keen ignored him, his eyes never leaving Rachel's. "Fear is a brittle thing, Rachel. It breaks the moment someone finds something they love more than they fear the pain. Susan thinks she has power because she has connections and a checkbook. But she is weak. Do you know why?" Rachel shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Because she would sacrifice anyone to save herself," Keen said. He stepped closer to Rachel, his shadow swallowing her. "True power isn't about who you can crush. It's about who you are willing to die for. You stood in that diner and looked at a man with a gun, and you didn't move. Not because you weren't afraid, but because that girl's life was more important than your own heartbeat. That is the only power that matters in my world." He turned to the prisoner. "This man was offered a fortune to hurt you. He took the money because he loves gold more than he loves his own honor. That makes him a liability. Not because he's a criminal, but because he has nothing he's willing to die for." Keen didn't signal for a hit. He didn't raise a hand. He simply looked at Victor. "Remove him from the city. If he ever breathes the same air as Miss Jackson again, don't ask for instructions." As the man was dragged away, the warehouse fell back into a hollow, haunting silence. Keen reached out, his fingers brushing the line of Rachel's jaw. His touch was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the cold steel of his words. "The world will try to tell you that you are just a waitress who got lucky," he whispered, his dark eyes searching hers. "They will try to find your price. They will try to make you afraid. But remember what you felt when you held Kay's hand in that booth. You didn't do it for a tip. You did it because it was yours to protect." Rachel looked around the dark, cavernous space. She saw the men in the shadows, the black cars, the weight of an empire built on blood and secrets. She realized then that Keen wasn't just hiring a guardian for his daughter. He was showing her the throne. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice steadying. "Because Susan has made her move," Keen said, his expression hardening into a mask of lethal intent. "And when the war comes to my front door, I don't need a servant. I need a matriarch. I need the woman who made the king of the city wait for her permission." He offered his hand. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, but a pact. Rachel looked at his palm, then at the darkness of the warehouse, and finally back at the man who had seen a hero in a stained apron. She took his hand. Her fingers were small in his, but her grip was like iron. "Then teach me the rest," she said. The storm that had been brewing for days finally broke, lashing the Ballard estate with a fury that drowned out the hum of the security perimeter. Inside the nursery, the air was still, thick with the scent of lavender and the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down to a collision. Rachel sat in the rocker, her eyes fixed on the door. She hadn't slept in 48 hours. She didn't need Keen's monitors to tell her the atmosphere had changed. She could feel the pressure in her marrow. When the power flickered once, then died, plunging the room into a velvet blackness, Rachel didn't scream. She stood up and moved to Kay's bedside, her hand finding the girl's shoulder in the dark. "Stay under the covers, Kay," Rachel whispered, her voice a low, steady anchor. "Don't make a sound." A soft click echoed, the sound of a deadbolt being bypassed. The nursery door swung open, framed by the jagged flash of lightning from the hallway windows. Susan stood there. She wasn't the polished socialite anymore. Her hair was damp and wild, her eyes blown wide with a frantic, shattered light. In her hand, she gripped a small silver pistol that looked like a toy but carried the weight of a final, desperate act. "Where is she?" Susan hissed, her voice a ragged edge. "Where is the little brat who ruined my life?" Rachel stepped forward, moving into the sliver of moonlight that cut across the floor. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't call for the guards she knew were currently being diverted by Susan's paid infiltrators. She simply stood between the bed and the barrel of the gun. "She's exactly where she belongs, Susan," Rachel said. Her heart was a drum, but her feet were lead. "Safe. Something she never was with you. Get out of the way, you pathetic little drudge," Susan snarled, taking a step into the room. The gun wavered, shaking in her grip. "You think you're special because he looked at you? You're a placeholder, a charity project. I was a Ballard before you knew how to spell the name." "You were a parasite," Rachel countered. She didn't raise her voice. She let it drop into that metallic, shovel-on-stone resonance she had found in the diner. "You didn't love Keen, and you certainly didn't love Kay. You loved the shadow they cast. And now that you're standing in the light, you're disappearing." "I'll kill you," Susan whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I'll kill you both and tell Keen it was an intruder. I'll be the grieving widow. I'll have it all back." Rachel took a step toward the gun. She felt the cold air of the room, the heat of her own blood, and the absolute terrifying clarity of her purpose. She remembered the warehouse, and Keen's voice telling her that power wasn't about the gun. It was about who you were willing to die for. "Then pull the trigger," Rachel said. She opened her arms, her body a physical wall of flesh and bone in front of the huddled shape on the bed. "But look at me when you do it. Look at the waitress who did in one night what you couldn't do in 6 years. I'm not afraid of you, Susan, because even if you kill me, you've already lost. Kay doesn't even remember your face when she's scared. She remembers mine." The lightning flashed again, a blinding white strobe that illuminated the raw, naked truth of the room. Susan looked at Rachel, really looked at her, and saw a woman who wasn't playing a part. She saw the neon shield. She saw the soul that couldn't be bribed. Susan's hand began to shake violently. The silver pistol dipped. The silence of the room was suddenly filled with the sound of Susan's ragged, breaking sobs. The weapon clattered to the floor, a hollow, pathetic sound against the expensive rug. "I had everything," Susan wailed, collapsing to her knees. "I had everything." "You had nothing," Rachel said softly, moving to pick up the gun and sliding it into the pocket of her robe. "Because you didn't know what to keep." The lights surged back to life, brilliant and unforgiving. The door crashed open, and Keen Ballard burst in, his coat gone, his shirt stained with rain, a heavy black handgun in his grip. He stopped dead, his eyes darting from the broken woman on the floor to Rachel, who was standing tall, her hand resting back on the edge of Kay's bed. Keen looked at the gun in Rachel's pocket, then at the calm, unyielding expression on her face. He didn't go to Susan. He didn't even look at the threat he had come to neutralize. He walked straight to Rachel. He placed a hand on the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her ear, his forehead dropping to touch hers. He was shaking, not with fear, but with the aftershock of a man who had almost lost the only thing that made him feel human. "You're safe," he rasped. "We're safe," Rachel corrected, her eyes drifting to Kay, who was peeking out from under the duvet. Keen pulled back just enough to look at her, a dark, fierce pride burning in his gaze. He didn't see a protector anymore. He saw his equal, the woman who didn't need his empire to stand her ground, but who was the only one worthy of ruling it by his side. The aftermath of the storm left the city air crisp, scrubbed clean of the grime that usually clung to the streets of Queens. At the Ballard estate, the shattered glass had been replaced, the shadows of the previous night swept away by a staff that now moved with a new, quiet reverence whenever Rachel entered a room. They no longer saw a girl out of her depth. They saw the woman who had stared down a bullet without blinking. Rachel stood in the grand dressing room of the master suite, staring at the woman in the mirror. She wore a gown of midnight silk that flowed like water, hugging a frame that had grown stronger, steadier. In the weeks since she'd left the diner, there was no light blue polyester here.
No grease esta inedapren.
But as she touched the hollow of her throat, she realized the fire she'd carried in that neon-lit booth hadn't been replaced. It had simply been refined. A heavy, familiar footfall echoed behind her. Keen appeared in the doorway, his reflection joining hers. He had traded his tactical gear for a tailored tuxedo, yet he still carried the aura of a man who ruled by iron and intent. He walked toward her, his eyes dark and fixed on her face with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. "The cars are waiting," Keen said, his voice a low, gravelly silk. "The city expects to see the woman who saved the Ballard heir. They expect a nanny. They expect a subordinate." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a velvet box. He didn't open it immediately. He held it between them, the weight of it representing a world Rachel had once only watched through the windows of expensive storefronts. "I told you once that power is about who you are willing to die for," Keen murmured, stepping closer until the heat of him radiated through her silk dress. "But I was wrong about one thing. Power is also about who makes it worth living." He flipped the lid. Inside sat a diamond of such impossible clarity it seemed to have trapped a star. It wasn't a delicate trinket. It was a bold, brilliant stone set in platinum, designed to be seen, to be feared, and to be respected. "Rachel S. Jackson," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a vow. "You gave my daughter a mother when she was abandoned. You gave this house a soul when it was just a fortress. And you gave me a reason to look at the dawn without wondering if it would be my last." He took her hand, the same hand that had gripped a stained rag, the same hand that had caught a falling child, and slid the ring onto her finger. The weight of it was a cold, beautiful anchor. "I'm not a queen, Keen," Rachel said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. "I'm just a girl from a diner who couldn't look away. That is exactly why you are the only one I will ever permit to wear that crown," Keen replied. He leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that tasted of rain, salt, and the future they had forged in the dark. They walked down the grand staircase together, hand in hand. At the bottom, Kay stood waiting, dressed in a matching navy velvet dress, her face glowing with a peace that had once seemed impossible. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a princess standing beside her shield. As the heavy oak doors of the estate opened, a phalanx of black cars waited, their engines humming in a synchronized chorus of power. The men in suits, Victor and the others, bowed as Rachel passed. It wasn't the bow they gave Keen, born of fear and hierarchy. It was a bow of genuine allegiance to the woman who had proven she was the bravest person in the empire. Rachel looked back one last time at the towering stone walls of the fortress. She thought of the red neon sign, the smell of burnt coffee, and the weary waitress she used to be. That girl was gone, but her heart remained. The heart of a protector, the heart of a mother who wasn't defined by blood, but by sacrifice. Keen handed her into the lead car, sliding in beside her as the gates of the estate swung wide. The king of the city took the hand of his new matriarch, and as they drove toward the lights of the skyline, the city finally understood the unbelievable truth. The waitress hadn't just saved the child. She had captured the king.